Did you know that behind the splendor of the Bourbon dynasty, the line that ruled France from 1589 to 1792, and again from 1814 to 1848, and Spain from 1700 to the present day, lies a vault of intrigue packed with covert alliances, royal assassinations, and billion-dollar colonial deals that reshaped Europe. In today's video, we pull back the curtain on the secret history of the Bourbon family, from the power plays that built Versailles to scandals that still echo through the modern Spanish crown. If you're fascinated by French royalty, eager to learn how the Bourbons preserved their throne for more than 3 centuries, and curious why their influence endures in today's Iberian monarchy, you're in the right place. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, and dive with us into the world where power, wealth, and scandal were forever intertwined, the untold secrets of the Bourbon dynasty. Picture yourself standing in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. Sunlight ricochets off hundreds of gilded surfaces, puddling in bright pools across marble floors that once echoed with the polished heels of Louis XIV and his glitter-eyed courtiers. Now widen that lens. Imagine, at the very same moment, a mule train inching down a fog-soaked Andean pass, each animal laden with 50-pound ingots dug from the silver-rich veins of Upper Peru, gold and silver from Spanish America, taxes from peasant smallholdings in the Auvergne, tariffs squeezed from every furled sail docking at French Atlantic ports, and, yes, gala evenings powered by champagne fountains so cold the bottles frosted white, all of it fed the colossal appetite of the Bourbon dynasty. Yet the Bourbons did not begin as blue blood paragons marinating in old money. When the first Capetian offshoot called Bourbon emerged, its fortune still reeked of wet clay and fresh timber, closer to frontier startups than to the smooth mahogany desks of entrenched bankers. It was, in modern terms, new money, a lot like the tidy stack Miami pioneer William Brickell cobbled together by swapping rum and rope with passing schooners. What changed, and how the Bourbons made the jump from eager arrivistes to guardians of Europe's most opulent hereditary purse, is the tale we're about to unwrap. Cast the clock back to 1272. Robert, Count of Clermont, youngest son of King Louis IX, married Beatrice of Bourbon, and in that union, the dynasty took its first breath. Their lands were respectable but hardly jaw-dropping. Think of a mid-size railroad baron before he hits oil. For 2 centuries, the house hustled, adding fiefs, buying allies, drawing revenue from mills and toll bridges. They were rich by medieval standards, but in the French pecking order, they still ranked somewhere below the flamboyant Valois courts or the Habsburg juggernaut stretching from Vienna to Valladolid. Then, December 1589, Henry of Navarre, a Bourbon cousin with a musketeer's swagger, rode into Paris as King Henry IV of France. His coronation turned family business linted into Crown Ink. Overnight, every pine-scented timber tract and grain tithe belonged to the monarchy. But being king was not enough for a man determined to bury decades of religious war. Henry married Marie de Medici. Yes, one of those banking Medicis of Florence, whose dowries came packed in Florentine florins, and suddenly Bourbon cash mingled with Italian banking savvy. Picture Aristotle Onassis clasping Jackie Kennedy's gloved hand on Scorpios Island. Politics, prestige, and cold currency soldered together in a single photo flash. That marriage supplied not just bags of gold, but a pipeline of Renaissance artisans, who later coached French architects in the symmetrical language that would reach its crescendo under Louis XIV. Fast forward to 1643. The 5-year-old Louis inherited the throne with the treasury straining under war costs. Guided by Mother Regent Anne of Austria, another Habsburg tie, and the wily Cardinal Mazarin. He watched how centralized authority could spin straw into bullion. By adulthood, Louis XIV believed l'état, c'est moi, and he set out to build a palace to prove it. When Versailles morphed from a royal hunting lodge into a city of gold leaf, he wasn't just inflating his ego, he was minting what real estate moguls later called branding. Versailles became the Bourbon answer to the Habsburgs' Schönbrunn and the Ottomans' Topkapi, a three-dimensional press release telegraphing wealth, taste, and invincibility. The expense staggered accountants. Construction alone gulped almost a quarter of France's annual revenue at peak years. Courtiers might bristle at the taxes on salt and grain, yet when they paraded under chandeliers the size of galleons, few dared question Louis's divine right. Culture, too, became a financial instrument. Louis bankrolled Molière's comedies, The Misanthrope, Tartuffe, knowing full well that Parisian theater carried the same soft power punch as a modern Whitney Museum retrospective. Scholars now credit that investment with solidifying French as Europe's diplomatic lingua franca for 2 centuries. Think of how Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney used radical American art to convert social capital into lasting influence. Louis did that at stadium scale, gilding his ledger not only with taxes, but with the priceless currency of prestige. Yet even royals need a diversified portfolio. Enter Spain. Dynastic marriages had been crossing the Pyrenees for generations. But when the last Habsburg king, Charles II, died childless in 1700, he willed the Spanish throne and its American colonies to Louis XIV's grandson Philip. Suddenly, Bourbon reach spanned from Gascony farm fields to the silver pits of Potosi, to the sugar crescents of Cuba, to the Manila galleons, carting silk and porcelain across the Pacific. Those galleons function like floating Wall Street vaults. One good year could underwrite 3 mediocre ones, and some calico bolts fetched higher margins in Seville than Apple stock after an iPhone launch. Philip V's Bourbon Spain routed profits through Seville's Casa de Contratación, institutionalizing the empire's silver inflow with a bureaucracy so fat you could stuff a corgi inside. The gold doubloons that rattled onto Madrid counting tables built the Escorial's libraries, filled the Prado, opened in 1819 by Ferdinand VII, with Velázquez portraits still haunting viewers today, and subsidized the Bourbon cousins back in Paris whenever French harvests failed. All this expansion, though, sprouted thorns. Wars of Spanish succession, Austrian succession, Jenkins's ear, you name it. A Bourbon was usually in the cast list. Campaigns drained coffers even faster than Versailles banquets. Meanwhile, philosophers sharpened quills. Voltaire sneered at absolutism, Rousseau muttered about general will. The king's accountants raised the gabelle, salt tax, and the taille, land tax, noting quietly that Dutch and English traders practicing a leaner brand of mercantilism were eating French lunch on the high seas. French mercantile fleets still made fine money shipping cognac to Newfoundland codfishers, but profit margins tightened like corset stays. By the late 1780s, the ledger bled red ink. You know the next act. A Paris mob, a curious device called the guillotine, Louis XVI, bidding a trembling farewell in January 1793. The revolutionaries stripped crown lands, the Tuileries, portions of Versailles itself, declaring them biens nationaux, national goods. Unlike the Vanderbilts, who simply frittered away estates through Gilded Age extravagance, the Bourbon lost much of theirs at sword point and auction block, yet history, like real estate, loves a comeback. In 1814, the Bourbon brothers tiptoed home, and though much property remained in Republican hands, a careful legal portfolio emerged. Spanish Bourbons, having outlasted Napoleonic invasion, sheltered art and jewels in family foundations. Proto-versions of Mellon Trust that shielded Andrew Mellon's fortune from aggressive taxation under FDR. The Bourbons learned, if you can't keep the palace, keep the paintings in a safe country. Let's pause for a breath. Because any dynasty to survive needs more than coins and castles. It needs the sheen of legitimacy that smooths the rough bark of privilege. The industrial tycoon Edward Doheny could afford Californian oil wells taller than church steeples, yet the Teapot Dome scandal tarnished his name so badly that generations later, people still whisper bribery when they tour his Greystone mansion. The Bourbons knew that whiff of scandal too. Rumors of Marie Antoinette's Austrian sympathies, whispers of Philippe Egalité's treachery, pamphlets depicting courtiers as vampires sucking peasant blood. Every revolution reopened those wounds, so the family leaned harder on cultural philanthropy, pious endowments, plays, ballets, hospitals, to paper over old grievances. For example, Ferdinand VII's reign in Spain ushered in a wave of museum collecting that, intentionally or not, repositioned the dynasty as protectors of universal heritage. Goya's black paintings and Velázquez's Las Meninas entered public imagination less as royal vanity objects and more as humanitarian gifts to the people, art as social apology. That strategy foreshadows how modern scions rehabilitate image. See how the Whitney family's museum recast robber baron glow into benevolent patronage. Still, no amount of portraiture could hide the fiscal math. By the late 19th century, the industrial boom had shifted the world's financial center to New York, exactly where William Randolph Hearst built his San Simeon castle, festooning it with ceilings ripped from Spanish monasteries. Bourbon wealth, though enormous, now looked old-fashioned beside Rockefeller oil dividends and Morgan banking syndicates. The family's clout cooled, but a core reserve, jewel collections, agricultural rents in Andalusia, minority stakes in European banks hung on, quietly compounding like well-managed index funds. Meanwhile, offstage, the Manila galleons sailed their final run in 1815, yet their legacy in bullion reserves lingered in Madrid's treasury, ultimately underwriting Spain's railroad expansion in the 1850s. Those lines converged at ports funneling Castilian wheat to Cuba and sugar back again, padding import-export ledgers that still paid royal household salaries through the Spanish Republic of 1931. Even today, genealogists count trust-controlled farms in La Mancha and vineyard acres in Catalonia as direct descendants of 16th century colonial patents. So what does all this mean for the idea of new money turning old? Look at Miami's William Brickell again. In the 1870s, he swapped trading post-scrap lumber for Biscayne Bay land that his heirs later flipped to condo developers. And within half a century, his surname meant respectability. The same arc the Bourbons traced across centuries. But time matters. In a medieval economy, you needed generations to calcify new wealth into dynastic bedrock. By the 20th century, a single stock option windfall could catapult a programmer from rented studio to Forbes list in under a decade. Old money thus became less about tenure and more about narrative control, curating stories of art, charity, and tasteful discretion. That's precisely where the Bourbons excel today. King Felipe VI of Spain, as of this recording, earns a government salary transparent to the Eurocent. His mother, Queen Sofia, champions Alzheimer's research. His father, King Juan Carlos, once celebrated for shepherding Spain to democracy, abdicated in 2014 amid Swiss bank allegations. A reminder that legitimacy remains negotiable, as fragile as Doheny's, as scrutinized as any Silicon Valley IPO. Yet the Bourbon brand persists because assets survive in legally protected silos. Private foundations hold tapestries Louis XIV commissioned. Spanish tax law shields certain royal parcels from outright sale. Modern analysts compare that structure to the Mellon family trusts that still drip dividends from Alcoa and Gulf Oil long after the patriarch died. Where the Vanderbilts once controlled a fortune roughly equal to 1/87th of U.S. GDP and managed to squander most of it before World War II, the Bourbons learned to step around such pitfalls. They turned estates into museums, sold naming rights to gala wings, forged corporate alliances with European banks. Alliances less romantic than Philip Ferry's Habsburg marriage, but arguably more profitable. Henry IV, the swaggering Béarnais who liked his wine red, his boots muddy, and, to the everlasting annoyance of hard-line Catholics, his kingdom calm. He had soothed Protestant Huguenots with the Edict of Nantes, declaring in 1598 that difference in religion no longer meant a difference in civil rights. He slashed taxes on salt, planted mulberry trees to kickstart a silk industry, and dreamed of a pan-European crusade against Spanish Habsburg arrogance. And then, on the 14th of May, 1610, while his coach inched through the bottlenecked Rue de la Ferronnerie, everything changed with two quick thrusts of a long kitchen knife. The blade belonged to François Ravaillac, a failed schoolteacher turned Catholic zealot, convinced that God had whispered a murderous command into his ear. Ravaillac's first lunge ricocheted off the king's rib, but the second punch found soft flesh near the heart. Henry slumped, whispering only, "It's nothing," before crimson spread across the white lace of his doublet. Within minutes, the Lion of France was dead, and pandemonium erupted. Street vendors bolted their shutters, priests knelt in prayer, and courtiers sprinted to the Louvre to brace the widowed Marie de Medici for a regency she had neither sought nor expected. According to eyewitness diaries, like that of noblewoman Charlotte Duplessis, Marie's crown had barely cooled from the coronation ceremony staged literally the day before. One chronicler quipped that Parisians heard 2 trumpet calls in 48 hours, the first proclaiming a queen, the second proclaiming a corpse. Now the bare facts of the murder are as solid as the cobbles beneath Ravaillac's feet. He acted alone, he confessed under excruciating torture, and he was torn limb from limb in the Place de Grève on 27th May, while a horrified crowd fought for bloody souvenirs of the regicide. Yet from the moment the king's body stiffened, whispers flared that Ravaillac had been but the point of a much longer Jesuit spear. Why, skeptics asked, would a lowly fanatic suddenly strike only weeks after Henry's spymaster, the Duke of Sully, leaked plans for a war to rescue Protestant princes in the German duchies of Jülich-Cleves? Why did those plans explicitly threaten Spanish strongholds, the very cause championed by militant Catholics and allegedly by Rome's soldiers' priests? Jesuit involvement was never proven, yet it has never fully died as a possibility. Surviving correspondence from Père Coton, Henry's own Jesuit confessor, shows frantic attempts to distance the Society of Jesus from Ravaillac before investigators could even enter the monastery archives. A decade later, pamphleteers dredged up an earlier attempt on Henry's life by Jean Châtel in 1594, noting that Châtel, like Ravaillac, had once lodged in a Jesuit household. Modern historian Patrice Guineffe calls this guilt by hallway association, but admits that the smoking cassock theory resonated in a France still raw from dressing its wounds along sectarian fault lines. Equally compelling was what did not happen, a furious Bourbon crackdown on the order. Instead, Marie de Medici urged Parliament to hush the rumors, warning that a witch hunt would tip the realm back into civil war. One ambassador wrote home that the Queen would rather swallow molten lead than reopen the saint. Bartholomew Ledger. In other words, the dynasty buried inconvenient questions for the same reason the Stuarts had smothered talk about Lord Darnley's suspicious 1567 explosion in Scotland. Royal stability mattered more than courtroom truth. The Crown was learning in real time the high cost of transparency. Still, plausible motives abound. The Edict of Nantes enraged Spanish diplomats who labeled it the Trojan horse of heresy. It also unsettled Pope Paul V, who privately dubbed Henry the penitent with one foot in Gehenna. Add the king's voguish talk of a European grand design to balance power across confessions, and you had exactly the kind of geopolitical cocktail that can coax daggers from cassocks. Remember, too, that Jesuits had only recently clawed their way back after being expelled in 1594 for, yes, suspected regicide. Historians like Roland Mousnier note that even loyal French Catholics distrusted them as foreign agents whose superior in Rome outranked any Gallic bishop. Comparisons with distant but eerily similar episodes sharpen the focus. When Hassan ibn Ali, grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, died of poisoning in 670, chroniclers whispered that the Umayyad Caliphate saw him as the last obstacle to consolidating Damascus-centered rule. Jump to 1917 and railroad tycoon. Henry Flagler's young widow, Mary Lily Keenan Flagler, falls fatally ill after drafting a will that would funnel millions away from certain relatives. Autopsy? None. Hearing? Barely. Like Henry IV's case, each story involves a fragile political equilibrium, a sudden death, and a meticulous effort to keep the machinery of power humming without public autopsy of motives. Whether the string pullers wore silk turbans, seersucker suits, or black soutanes, the pattern hums the same refrain. Remove the keystone quietly, or the arch may crumble on us all. Dig into Parisian archives, especially the Bastille registers, and you'll find scraps suggesting that at least a dozen lesser conspirators were interrogated and released within weeks. One, Jean Guénot, had scribbled marginalia in his prayer book, imploring the Virgin to cleanse France of false prophets. Another, Catherine Voisin, ran a lodging house where Ravaillac allegedly stayed the night before the murder. She emerged from the Bastille with a broken jaw and no charge sheets filed. Scholars who piece together these paper shards notice a striking pattern. Any testimony pointing toward organized clergy vanished behind the heavy green drapes of royal privilege. Sully himself admitted in his memoirs that certain depositions were deemed unsuitable to the tranquility of the state. And what of Ravaillac's own words? Under torture, he insisted he had acted alone, inspired not by Jesuit whispers, but by a fiery sermon in the Cathedral of Angoulême. Contemporary theologian Pierre Bayle later argued that torture extracted words, not truth, and that Ravaillac's confession read like a litany he thought his interrogators wanted. While hot iron sizzled, the would-be saint rambled that Henry planned a new war against the Pope, a claim historians dismiss as nonsense. Henry's secret dispatches sought papal blessing for his daughter's marriage only weeks earlier. The record smells of forced narrative, but forced narrative was exactly what the Bourbon inner circle needed. By covering up loose threads, the Regency bought itself breathing room. The Estates General that convened in 1614 tiptoed around regicide altogether, zeroing in on taxation and provincial rights instead. Marie de Medici flattered both Jesuit and Huguenot leaders, handing each side modest concessions, and thereby securing the throne for her son, the future Louis XIII. She placated Pope Paul V with lavish gifts, golden tableware, rumor has it, smelted from confiscated Spanish doubloons, while assuring Protestant princes that the Edict of Nantes was safe. In the short term, the tightrope act worked. Only decades later, when Louis XIV revoked the edict entirely, did France plunge back into confessional darkness. Picture the Bastille long after midnight, its ramparts slick with November drizzle, and hear the heavy gate moan open on iron hinges that never see daylight oil. A carriage rolls through the arch, wheels muffled in straw, and the driver refuses to glance over his shoulder, because the fewer details he remembers, the safer his tongue will be if a musketeer ever pins him to a wall. In the back of that carriage sits a man whose face is hidden behind a black velvet hood, stiffened with thin iron ribs. No clank of chains, no gag, just the quiet swish of costly wool sleeves as he folds his hands the way a courtier might during Mass. The turnkey, following orders signed by Louis XIV himself, will speak to this prisoner only as Monsieur. He will never ask a question, never lift the mask, and never write the man's name on any scrap that could be found by a clerk. For 34 years, from the late summer of 1669 until a cold autumn morning in 1703, this stranger is transferred along a grim relay race of fortresses, always under the same jailer, Benigne d'Auvergne de Saint-Mars, whose loyalty earns him a staggering bonus of 3,000 livres a year. That sum could have bought a handsome townhouse on the Ile Saint-Louis, yet Saint-Mars spends it on reinforced doors, extra guards, and fines leveled against anyone who so much as murmurs a description of the captive's eyes. The paper trail starts in Versailles, where a coded dispatch leaves the king's council chamber. It orders Saint-Mars, then governor of Pignerol, a forgotten Alpine citadel, to receive Eustache Dauger, a prisoner whose identity must remain known only to you. Archivists checking watermarks on the document can prove it was folded by a royal secretary named Michel Letellier, Colbert's ally, sometime in late August 1669. But the name Eustache Dauger lights up nobody's baptism register, wills, or muster, rolls except for a fleeting appearance in the household accounts of Nicolas Fouquet, the disgraced superintendent of finances. To Josephine Wilkinson, whose 2022 book The King's Shadow tallies every suspect in the case, that alone screams alias. Louis' scribes seldom fumbled genealogy. If the prisoner were an ordinary felon, he'd have traveled in shackles, not secrecy. Voltaire, forever sharpening quills against Bourbon pride, later claimed the man wore an iron mask locked beneath the chin, ate from silver plates that were melted down after each meal, and faced instant death should he speak to anyone except Saint-Mars. Curators at the Musée de l'Armée who study 17th century restraint devices insist a full iron helmet would have made breathing torture. They suspect a lighter velvet hood sewn with iron battens near the cheeks so it could not simply be ripped away. Either way, the mask isn't theatrical window dressing. It's state technology, as essential to Louis's image management as the mirrors inside Versailles. Why spend so much gold hiding one face? Court rumor flowed thicker than wine. Gazette de France scribes whispered that the prisoner was an illegitimate son of Louis XIII, making him Louis XIV's half-brother, and thus a potential rival in an era when bloodlines could tip armies into battle. BBC History's 2023 documentary Versailles, Behind the Mirrors, revisited that rumor, setting animated family trees ablaze with question marks. A second theory, championed by historian Paul Sénac after a 2021 comb-through of Vatican cryptography packets, points to Louis's own secretary, Dauger de Cavois, who supposedly stumbled onto evidence that Fouquet was funneling kickbacks to Queen Mother Anne of Austria. Cavoye vanishes from Paris registers exactly as the masked prisoner appears in Pignerol, which looks suspicious until you notice Cavoye's younger brother marrying, hosting soirée, and suing neighbors in court records long after 1669. An inconvenient fact Sonnac waves away but cannot erase. The workhorse theory still belongs to Émile Burgot, the 19th century archivist who first floated Ercole Antonio Mattioli, an Italian diplomat who accepted French bribes during the back-channel sale of Casale Monferrato, then leaked the deal to Spain. Smithsonian Magazine revisited Burgot's dossier in an April 2024 feature, noting that Marchioli, scrawled on the death notice in 1703, might be lazy French phonetics for Mattioli. Yet why disguise Mattioli when unfaithful informants were normally hanged in public? The answer returns to optics. Louis couldn't risk foreign ambassadors seeing a shamed envoy paraded through Paris. Better to erase him so thoroughly that each rival court imagined someone even more dangerous inside that mask. Whatever the man's birth, Louis's motive was dynastic legitimacy, the same obsession that once pushed England's Richard III to hide the princes in the Tower and Spain's guardians to brand Joanna of Castile insane, not out of cruelty alone, but as a tidy administrative shortcut around messy succession laws. Louis was a child during the Fronde rebellions and had watched pamphleteers reduce his mother to caricature and his ministers to devils with quills for pitchforks. He learned early that the quickest way to kill a rumor is to lock away the evidence before it walks into a salon. St. Mars proved the perfect accomplice. Born to a modest Burgundian family, he rose in the military bureaucracy through fanatical order-keeping and a knack for writing letters so polite they could lull auditors to sleep. From Pignerol, he shuffled the prisoner to Exiles, a jagged outcrop that even goats avoided, then to Sainte Marguerite, an island fortress off Cannes, where salt spray chewed soldier boots to leather lace. Each relocation came with a fresh bundle of royal warrants, spelling out everything from candle rations to the prohibition against speaking the prisoner's baptismal name aloud. When St. Mars earned promotion to governor of the Bastille in 1698, he insisted the masked man ride north with him, sealed inside a cage hung in an ox-drawn cart and draped in oilcloth so thick the prisoner almost suffocated on the first day. Lieutenant de Junca, the Bastille's deputy, jotted in the daybook that the new inmate wore a mask of black velvet fastened by steel springs, a phrase that later sent Hollywood wardrobe departments into ecstasy. De Junca might have embellished. Scribes love to flourish, but he verified the cell assignment. Second floor, B3, a chamber overlooking the Seine, where church bells promised freedom twice a day. Tiny details that survive in the archives tease biographers with contradictions. Laundry bills ordered for the prisoner list extra fine batiste shirts and hand-turned cuffs, wardrobe luxuries no servant could afford. Kitchen ledgers show roast partridge, veal, fresh fruit, and a bottle of wine per day. A royal diet even modern cardiologists would side-eye. In 1701, St. Mars bought his charge a lute, perhaps to ward off the madness that echoes in stone cells. Musicianship hints at noble upbringing. Then again, it could be a cruel gesture echoed centuries later at Guantanamo, where interrogators blasted Sesame Street songs. The prisoner's only visible possession at death was a leather portfolio of loosely sketched fort plans. Real knowledge or the daydream scribbles of a bored mind? During those final Paris years, Voltaire ignited the twin brother theory. Writing decades later, he swore that Louis XIV had been born with a younger twin whom Cardinals Mazarin and Richelieu whisked away to prevent disputed succession. The man in the iron mask, in Voltaire's telling, was the twin who somehow survived infancy, a walking time bomb of hereditary chaos. The story thrilled readers of the philosophical letters, prompting engravers to issue lurid prints within a week. The Monegasque glossy point of view revived the tale in 2022, comparing it to the Tudor mystery of the princes in the Tower. TikTok historians spliced baby portraits of Louis with AI renderings of an imaginary twin, racking up millions of views before French fact-checker Le Décodeur stamped the trend hautement spéculatif. Their reasoning is simple. No wet nurse received hush money pensions, no midwives vanished, and St. Mars's receipts never list baby care supplies. Yet in the algorithmic age, a good royal conspiracy runs on likes, not ledgers. More cautious researchers dig into codebooks. In 2019, a team at the Université d'Aix fed Sam Mars's correspondence through text frequency software. They noticed that letters about Eustache Dauger use court etiquette terms reserved for minor nobility, votre grâce, instead of the servant class, vous. That supports the half-brother or diplomat theory, but leaves the servant hypothesis gasping. Critics counter that when St. Mars copied the king's language, he automatically elevated everyone's titles. Algorithms, they warn, don't always grasp context. Even so, their paper in the Journal of Historical Cryptography remains the most data-driven study the case has seen. Other scholars scavenge side corridors. The Italian State Archives in Mantua hold a contract signed by Mattioli's son in 1694, acknowledging a royal French pension of 3,000 livres, exactly St. Mars's bonus. Why pay hush money to an Italian count if he was already dead? Unless, skeptics say, the pension was compensation for silence about a different prisoner entirely. So the circle closes and reopens like a Mobius strip. Every new clue reshapes the suspect list without shrinking it. Real-world effects of the mystery radiated far beyond one cell door. By 1700, Louis's secret had already morphed into bureaucratic folklore. Cardinal Fleury, who steered France through Regency turbulence after Louis's death, reportedly warned chatty clerks that the Bastille has room for those who gossip. In the 1780s, revolt fermented on rumors that nobles kept grain off markets. Pamphleteers spliced drawings of an iron-masked skeleton onto diatribes calling for heads to roll. So when Parisians stormed the Bastille on July 14th, 1789, they expected to free dozens of political prisoners. They found only 7, 4 forgers, 2 lunatics, and a count locked up for incest. But they looted dusty display cases labeled Masque de Fer, convincing themselves they had just liberated the ghost of monarchy's darkest secret. The image stuck. Even today, French schoolchildren recite the Bastille myth as proof that tyrants fall when ordinary people demand receipts. Picture the hall of mirrors on a winter night, 1,000 candles trembling in crystal chandeliers, the polished floor reflecting a galaxy of gold brocade and powdered hair, and at the far end, under the ceaseless gaze of 21 mirrors, stands a young queen toying with her fan, as a tall, broad-shouldered Swede in a midnight blue coat knots his fingers behind his back, trying to look casual, yet unable to tear his eyes from her. That single glance whispered the gossips of 1784, was enough to awaken a love so fierce it would flicker through smoldering letters and coded ciphers, survive the terror of revolution, and rattle historians all the way to the 21st century. Few affairs have been buried so deeply and exhumed so often as the rumored passion between Marie Antoinette of France and Count Axel von Fersen of Sweden, a romance so inconvenient that court archivists erased whole sentences. Palace officials looked the other way, and revolutionaries turned every rumor into gunpowder. Yet, like perfume sealed in a locket, the scent still escapes. Today we open that locket and let the story breathe. Marie Antoinette was 28 when she met Fersen in earnest, the daughter of an Austrian empress who had traded Vienna discipline for Versailles extravagance. The queen loved gambling at Faro, inventing rustic fantasies at her model village in Trianon, and teasing a public already angered by bread shortages. Fersen, 4 years her senior, was the eldest son of Sweden's most feared military reformer, Count Axel von Fersen the Elder. The younger Axel had already toured Europe with a reputation for Greek statue beauty, brilliant horsemanship, and a gift for languages. His blue-gray eyes and decisive jaw inspired the painter Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun to sigh that he looked like a hero of antiquity stepped down from a frieze. When he first reached Versailles in 1774, Antoinette was still an unsteady dauphine, awkward in her new country. Legend says she mispronounced French so adorably that courtiers repeated her blunders as fashion. Fersen bowed, chatted politely, then rode off to war in America, where he served without pay on the staff of the Comte de Rochambeau and watched Yorktown surrender beneath a harvest moon. His dispatches glowed with admiration for Washington's calm, but one entry pulses with warmer voltage. In France, a queen waits whose spirit equals any general's. Scholars believe that line foreshadows far more than politics. By 1783, Fersen had returned to Paris. Friendships ripened. The queen eyed him during masked balls, and he in turn stood guard near her private supper room, wearing a domino cloak whose collar hid everything but those piercing eyes. At first, the dangerous tension masqueraded as formal courtesy. He escorted her favorite, the Princesse de Lamballe, on moonlit carriage rides. He addressed Marie Antoinette in a Swedish-flavored French that sounded slightly musical, slightly mocking, but soon the queen was summoning him to billiards at 2 a.m, and liveried servants noticed an empty corridor between her apartments and his guest suite in the Cour des Princes. "Too many footsteps for pure coincidence," whispered the door wardens. Still, Antoinette's ladies-in-waiting kept silent. Fersen's valet learned discretion faster than he learned French. Both sides knew that to breathe a word was treason, because France was already a tinderbox. Revolutionary pamphleteers had long painted Antoinette as Madame Deficit, bleeding the treasury dry with silk gowns and imported Austrian violins. In 1785, the infamous diamond necklace affair, though she was blameless, framed her as a sexual conspirator. To fuel the outrage, caricaturists needed only one more spark, proof that the queen betrayed the king's bed. Thus, any rumor regarding Fersen had to be smothered, and quickly. The king himself, Louis XVI, remained outwardly oblivious, too absorbed in lock-making and chemistry to notice the tremor beneath court etiquette. Yet he understood political math. France could not survive another scandal. So the royal guard discreetly rotated Swedish officers elsewhere, kept palace corridors brightly lit, and confiscated personal correspondence that looked too affectionate. Despite the caution, letters flew. Fersen wrote from Paris, from Brussels, from his family's estate at Loevestad, always in code. Swedish and French phrases braided with numbers, Greek letters, and a mysterious brown ink that scabbed into the paper like dried blood. Marie Antoinette answered in a smaller, urgent hand, pressing flower petals between the folds, tulips during Lent, lilies for Easter, and once, during a drought, a single yellow rose crushed almost flat by the wax seal. Some letters survive. Others were torn into neat shreds, no wider than a matchstick. In 1877, a Swedish archivist puzzled over a bundle marked A to F and assumed it concerned artillery. He never guessed it meant Antoinette to Fersen. Fast forward to 2021. Conservation scientists at the French National Archives aimed an X-ray fluorescence spectrometer at several blank spaces in the Fersen dossier. Suddenly, invisible ink blazed across the screen. Phrases like bien aimé and adore follement, the latter an unfinished follement, meaning madly. In one letter dated 29th of January 1792, the Queen scrawled, "Non, je ne pourrai jamais cesser de vous aimer." No, I could never cease loving you. Someone, likely an anxious court secretary, had tried to obliterate the confession with iron gall wash, but chemistry resurrected it 2 centuries later. The discovery made headlines from Le Monde to The Guardian, and Harvard historian Evelyn Lever declared, if doubt remained, it is now reasonable to believe the intimacy was real. Yet a vocal minority of archivists retorted affection is not adultery. The debate rages, but fewer skeptics remain. Look backward for a moment at how carefully their world arranged cover stories. When Fersen reappeared at Versailles in the spring of 1787, courtiers described him as the Queen's Swedish knight, but only half-jokingly, for his chivalry had strategic overtones. He helped draft memoranda backing Minister Calonne's debt reduction schemes, attended music recitals beside Antoinette's harp, and once persuaded the king to raise additional grain shipments for a starving Rouen. No mere pretty face, Fersen understood statecraft. Swedish envoy Hans Gustaf Nordenkrantz noted, "Count Fersen carries a key to the Queen's political conscience." That key unlocked more than politics. By summer 1789, Paris howled. The Bastille fell on 14 July, and Fersen saw at a glance what Antoinette refused to admit. The monarchy was doomed unless they fled. He masterminded the plan later called the Flight to Varennes, drafting double-encoded courier routes, purchasing a yellow coach under a false name, and persuading the Queen to abandon half her luggage. Royal wet nurse Madame Roux recalled that Antoinette trusted only Monsieur de Fersen with her children's escape. On 20 June 1791, the royal family rattled out of the Tuileries at midnight. Fersen himself drove the first stage to Bondy, a scarf up to his nose, pistols under the seat. At dawn, he switched horses and galloped ahead to arrange relays. Every mile a gamble. When the coach rolled into Varennes on the 21st, rebels recognized the king's profile from an assignat banknote. Arrest followed, and Fersen, heartbroken, crossed into Belgium, disguised as Baron de Chouin, a name borrowed from Louis XIV's secret second wife, Marie-Françoise de Chouin, as though history teased itself. Correspondence grew frantic. 4 letters per week raced between Brussels and Paris, each smuggled inside candle molds, straw baskets, even the hollow quills of carrier pigeons. Many vanished. Still more arrived with paragraphs excised by nervous intermediaries. One fragment, now in Stockholm's Riksarkivet, reads, "Courage, the moment approaches. Remember our oath at Trianon." Some historians believe that oath referred to a secret promise of marriage wrung from the Queen in a chapel at her pastoral hamlet. Yet documentary proof remains tantalizingly just out of reach, 1 ink blot away, 1 missing page short. Comparison helps. American journalists have likened Fersen and Antoinette to Franklin D. Roosevelt and Lucy Mercer Rutherford, whose coded White House appointments became Washington's worst kept secret. British medievalists point to King James IV of Scotland's clandestine relationship with Janet Kennedy, disguised in court roles as Mademoiselle Anne Latour. In both cases, power demanded silence. Proximity trumped propriety. Modern biographers such as Catherine L. Brownlee argue that Fersen and Antoinette fit the same pattern, only with higher stakes. A collapsing Ancien regime, foreign armies massing on the Rhine, and pamphleteers itching to blame the Queen's Nordic stallion for every loaf of missing bread. To admit their intimacy, she writes, would have been to hand the revolutionaries an easy slogan: she beds a Swede while Paris starves. The monarchy could not survive that headline. It nearly didn't survive anyway. On the 10th of August, 1792, insurgents stormed the Tuileries. Fersen, frantic in Brussels, penned 12 pages promising money, carriages, even a Swedish frigate at Le Havre. He signed with a cipher of 2 interlocked hearts, 88, their private shorthand for eternity. Antoinette never saw the letter. It was intercepted, docketed, and eventually misfiled under election returns 1831. Meanwhile, the Queen was herded into the Temple prison, where she embroidered violets onto scraps of linen for comfort. According to her cellmate, Princess Elizabeth, she whispered Fersen's name only once after midnight, when she thought everyone was asleep. She asked for ink to write to him. The jailer refused. The Queen's trial began on the 14th of October, 1793. Jacobin prosecutors accused her of conspiring with foreign powers, orchestrating famine, and debauching the morals of France through Fersen. They waved pamphlets titled The Amour of that Austrian and her Vandal, but no witnesses could swear to seeing the lovers in bed. Even the infamous spy Bertrand de Molleville admitted he could provide only circumstantial glimpses. Lacking proof, the tribunal shifted to a more explosive charge: incest with her 8-year-old son, Louis Charles. Antoinette stifled a sob, then faced the women in the gallery and said, "Nature itself refuses to answer such a charge." The jury needed just one accusation to condemn. At dawn on the 16th of October, she climbed the scaffold, white shift billowing in the wind. Fersen was in Vienna, elbow deep in diplomatic cables, when he learned the news. His diary for that day reads simply, "The crime is accomplished." From a distance, the palace on the Manzanares shimmered like a fairy tale fortress, but in the corridors, where velvet muffled every footstep, Spain's first Bourbon king paced and fretted, unable to silence the drumbeat of conspiracies he swore he could hear beneath the floorboards. Philip V, grandson of Louis XIV, victor of the War of the Spanish Succession, and a man as devout as he was fearful, had inherited more than the crown of Castile and Aragon. He had inherited a country drained by war, a treasury propped up by the raw silver of the Indies, and a ruling class riddled with rival factions that had nearly handed the throne to the Austrian Habsburgs. In the 1720s, with his nerves fraying and his faith telling him that God still expected a reckoning, Philip turned to the one institution that had once terrorized every whisper of dissent: the Spanish Inquisition. Officially, the Holy Office had been languishing for decades, its autos de fe a memory, its censures a dull echo. But Philip remembered the stories his ministers told him about the Habsburg era, when heretics were hunted, conversos lived in dread, and royal authority felt as unshakable as Toledo steel. Reviving that atmosphere suited the moment. Across Europe, the Enlightenment was blooming in coffee houses, and Jansenist tracts seeped across the Pyrenees. Inside Spain, the Aragonese Cortes, the Catalan towns, and even a handful of renegade nobles still daydreamed about Habsburg restoration. To Philip, heresy, rebellion, and treason were a single twisted vine, and the sharpest blade he possessed to hack it down was the Inquisition. The first quiet order went out in the spring of 1721. The king's confessor, Father Guillaume Marie de Berge, carried a handwritten memorandum to the Suprema, the Inquisition's high council. It authorized expanded tribunals, a beefed-up informant network, and most important, an immediate infusion of bullion for the greater glory of God and the security of the realm. The bullion, freshly landed at Cadiz and Cartagena, gleamed with the stamp of the Lima and Potosi mints. Royal accountants logged it as revenue from the Quinto Real, the crown's 20% cut of colonial mining. In reality, says the 19th century chronicle, the Bourbons of Naples, a favorite of palace librarians because it traces the family's knack for power politics, fully 1/3 of that silver never reached the military or the public works Philip advertised in his speeches. Instead, it disappeared into chancery coffers labeled obras pias, pious works, a convenient euphemism for inquisitorial wages, jail renovations, and the purchase of fresh brands and shackles. The Habsburg playbook of funding faith with plundered metal had not been forgotten. It was simply repackaged as Bourbon righteousness. Over the next 5 years, Madrid's Archivo Histórico Nacional would record more than 1,900 new denunciations, a spike unseen since the 1660s. In Valencia, a single edict of faith in 1723 named 72 suspects, crypto-Jews, freethinkers, and, in a telling sign of the times, a handful of students rumored to be translating Locke. In Seville, the grand courtroom of San Fernando rang again with the dull thunder of fetters, while the plaza outside filled with the smell of pine tar whenever a convicted heretic was marched toward a ritualized public shaming. Not all sentences ended at the stake. Philip's revival valued intimidation as much as incineration, but in letters home, Dutch merchants complained that the silhouette of the Quemadero on the skyline was a smokestack of fear. Money was the fuel, and Mexico supplied it by the mule train. Warehouse manifests from Veracruz, preserved in the Gaceta de Mexico, list 1.2 million silver pesos earmarked for clergy stipends and other secret charges between 1722 and 1726. Each chest bore the stamp of Charles II, irony hanging like incense, because Charles was the last Habsburg Spain would ever see. Courtiers joked that the ghost of the bewitched king was still paying to keep heretics honest. Yet the bookkeeping trail is real. Modern historian Henry Kamen, digging through those same ledgers, calculated that inquisitorial spending in the decade after 1720 doubled compared with the entire previous 30 years. Philip swore to his French counselor, the Duke of St. Simon, that he only wished to defend the purity of the faith, but the political motive was as naked as the altar candles ablaze in every packed cathedral. A wave of pamphlets, some printed clandestinely in Naples, others smuggled by Genoese traders, claimed that the king's fragile mental health made him a puppet of Paris. Ever since rumors spread about his bouts of depression, his midnight sobbing, and his inability to bear loud music, factions seeking a regency for his son Ferdinand had sniffed opportunity. By turning the reconstituted Inquisition against Jansenist sympathizers, often a euphemism for anyone whispering about constitutional limits, Philip pruned that faction before it could blossom. The secrecy of the operation was remarkable even by Bourbon standards. Council minutes were coded, prisoner transfers took place in dead of night, and inquisitors received direct stipends in thick leather pouches that bypassed the Contaduría Mayor. Samuel Sharp, an English surgeon touring Spain in 1724, noted that tribunals appear solvent despite the general indigence of the realm, as though some hidden fountain of treasure irrigates them. That fountain was New World silver, and every glint of it was meant to keep the king's rivals too frightened or too poor to mount a challenge. Modern parallels make the logic clearer. Think of William Randolph Hearst secretly praising Adolf Hitler in private telegrams while publicly selling patriotic headlines, or Edward L. Dohany's clandestine payoff at Teapot Dome under the banner of resource security. Philip's strategy, cloak a raw power grab in the vestments of moral crusade, feels uncannily modern. One Madrid wag scribbling on a tavern wall crystallized the cynicism in 8 words: gold for God, fear for the king. Exactly how many lives the campaign cost is still disputed. Not long ago, a flurry of viral posts on X claimed tens of thousands were burned in a single decade. The archival math refuses that drama. Trial logs from Toledo and Granada between 1720 and 1730 name roughly 2,700 defendants. Sentences of relaxation, the code word for execution by fire, appear fewer than 60 times. Even one wrongful death is atrocity enough, but the real weapon here was psychological. The ever-present threat of the Inquisition under Philip V paralyzed conversation and kept monasteries full of repentant nobles who might otherwise have funded dissent. With every convoy from Veracruz, the king's confidence swelled, and so did the silver outflows. By 1725, the Casa de la Contratación in Seville tallied shipments at an 11-year high. Merchants griped that the crown's secret withdrawals were forcing them to pay higher fees for their own export permits. Meanwhile, Archbishop Diego de Astorga y Céspedes praised the monarch's vigilance against the creeping rot of impiety in pastoral letters printed in Salamanca. That applause mattered because Philip needed the church on his side to offset whispers that the French-born queen, Elizabeth Farnese, ran the state from behind the arras. In Naples, where a Bourbon cadet branch would one day rule, diplomats watched with fascination. A dispatch from the Neapolitan envoy to Vienna, quoted in the very source book that inspired this tale, The Bourbons of Naples, marveled that Madrid had conjured a climate of holy fear out of the very silver that once bought pleasantries for the Habsburg court. The envoy wondered aloud whether such a tactic could tame the fractious Italian barons. That was precisely the comparison Philip cherished. When king is alchemist enough, gold can be transmuted into obedience. And the king needed obedience desperately, because the shadows inside his mind were lengthening. Contemporary memoirs, including the Duchess of Abrantes' acid pen, recount nights when the monarch refused to change linen for weeks, certain that any touch would damn him. Yet by day, he signed new decrees empowering inquisitors to censor imported books, to raid Protestant chapels frequented by foreign traders, and to confiscate the estates of nobles suspected of collusion with Vienna. The Supreme Council, which once feared bankruptcy, now counted an annual budget that rivaled the Armadas in its prime. The numbers are plain in the Cédulas Reales surviving in Madrid's Biblioteca Nacional. Between 1722 and 1728, inquisitorial outlays averaged 450,000 pesos annually, dwarfing the 160,000 allotted to frontier fortifications. Colonial governors grumbled, but they did not dare refuse the extra levy known as the media annata, because parchment from the capital carried the weight of both crown and cross. Was it effective? In the narrow sense of keeping Philip on the throne, yes. No major uprising shook Spain before his abdication in 1724. Brief though that abdication was, and when he returned to power later the same year, after the sudden death of his son Louis I, the machinery of terror was oiled and ready. In fact, some scholars argue that the Inquisition's brief resurgence delayed Enlightenment reforms by at least a generation, ensuring Spain would stumble into the Napoleonic century less prepared than Britain or France. A warm June night drapes Paris in uneasy stillness, as if the city itself is holding its breath. Street lamps sputter, shadows pool across the cobblestones, and in the echoing corridors of the Tuileries Palace, the clank of a heavy lock seems louder than cannon fire. Inside, France's most famous couple huddle around a cluttered map, whispering like conspirators rather than monarchs. Louis XVI, exhausted but stubbornly hopeful, fingers a worn traveling cloak. Marie Antoinette, the incandescent queen, once caricatured as featherlight frivolity, pins up her hair and ties on the plain bonnet of a governess. They are not simply stepping out for air, they are betting the Bourbon crown on a desperate sprint to freedom, intent on meeting loyalist troops gathering near the frontier town of Montmédy. History will remember the mad dash as the flight to Varennes, but on this tense night of June 20th, 1791, it is still a secret so tightly wrapped that even the palace walls seem afraid to breathe its name. What makes this royal road trip so extraordinary is that it looks nothing like a royal road trip at all. Axel von Fersen, the charismatic Swedish count rumored, then and now, to be the Queen's confidant, and perhaps more, has masterminded the logistics. A gilt carriage big enough to swallow a hunting lodge will carry the family. Lighter relay coaches and decoy riders will clear the way. 6 horses wait at each post house, their flanks taut with nervous energy. The king, 6 feet tall and unmistakably broad-shouldered, squeezes into the livery of a humble valet answering to the name Monsieur Durand. Marie Antoinette's blonde curls vanish under the dowdy cap of a so-called governess, Madame Rocher. Their 8-year-old son, the Dauphin, becomes a girl, yes, a girl, in an embroidered bonnet, while the king's sister Elizabeth poses as a Russian baroness. If the disguises sound flimsy, that is because they are. Yet the very audacity of the masquerade is meant to disarm suspicion, a lesson Fersen claims to have borrowed from the 1688 escape plot of England's James II. If a Stuart king once slipped away under cover of night, why not the Bourbons? Web historians still marvel that the getaway could be kept quiet at all. Memoirs suggest Fersen communicated with the Queen through microscopic pinholes pricked into folded notes, then dusted over with chalk, an 18th century version of invisible ink. Others cite the unsigned letters archived at the Swedish National Library. Cross-references show handwriting remarkably like Fersen's, dotted with affectionate code names. Modern analysts poring over royalist correspondence argue that every movement of the plan, clock times, spare horses, bribes for postmasters, was laid out with near military precision, only to be undone by the single commodity the royals lacked: time. A new trove of Varennes arrest records, digitized in 2024 by France's National Archives, reveals frantic back and forth between local officials the moment the king's identity was suspected. Each dispatch is inked in a different hand, some lines splotched where the writer's pen plainly shook. The shape of the tragedy is everywhere inside those stains. To understand why Louis dared so wild a gamble, imagine the political pressure cooker of Paris in 1791. The National Assembly had stripped the crown of meaningful power. Angry pamphleteers lampooned the Queen as Madame Déficit, and bread riots had become grim background noise to daily life. Even the royal bodyguards, once a velvet wall of loyalty, buckled under revolutionary scrutiny. Rumors flashed like brush fire, one day of an Austrian invasion spearheaded by Marie Antoinette's brother Leopold II, the next of English bankers funding counter-revolution. Against this chorus of fear rose a quieter but no less urgent refrain from the districts east of Paris, where ex-army officer the Marquis de Bouillé drilled 10,000 soldiers sworn to defend the monarchy. Montmedy, hugging the Luxembourg border, offered stone fortifications, ample supplies, and perhaps the moral high ground from which to demand a new constitutional deal. But first, the king had to get there alive. The sun has barely set when a servant swings open an inconspicuous side gate, and the towering, overstuffed coach rumbles toward the Rue de l'Echelle. Fersen himself rides up front dressed as a humble coachman, cracking jokes in a coarse dialect to any curious passer-by. His presence is almost cinematic. Swedish State Archives release a charcoal sketch in 1890 showing him in tight breeches, head thrown back in laughter, an image now reproduced by every history blog that touches the story. Yet Fersen will vanish from the narrative long before Varenne. He hops down at Bondy, switching to a lighter saddle horse to avoid drawing crowds with the too regal carriage. Decades later, he confides to his diary, held today in Uppsala University Library, that handing the reins to a Parisian stableman felt like casting dice loaded by fate. Hour after hour, the overburdened royal coach creaks through villages that smell of fresh-cut hay and suspicion. At each relay station, the postilions grumble, "Why so many passengers on a single ticket? Why the odd accent of the so-called governess? Worse, the carriage simply moves too slowly. Carpenters had reinforced it to protect the queen from jostling, but the added weight now drags like an anchor." By the time dawn cools the sky over Chalon-sur-Marne, the schedule is 5 hours behind. A cascade of small misfortunes follows. The king lingers, chatting amiably with locals about crop prices, ignoring Fersen's strict timeline. One postmaster insists on verifying passports, newly printed, with a wax seal but suspiciously unstamped. And then comes the fatal encounter. Jean-Baptiste Drouet, the postmaster of Saint-Menehould, happens to glance at a 50-livre assignat bearing Louise's engraved profile and thinks the fellow in the back seat looks hauntingly familiar. Drouet's ride to Varennes has been mythologized. Newspaper cartoons in Le Moniteur Universel sketched him on a galloping horse, the breath of destiny steaming from its nostrils. In truth, he and fellow patriot Guillaume Saint-Étienne borrowed 2 draft horses so slow that later witnesses could walk beside them. But speed mattered less than conviction. The pair reached Varennes around 11 p.m. and threw the town into a frenzy. Within minutes, the mayor, Etienne Sauce, yes, Sauce, barred the narrow bridge over the Aire River with overturned wagons, and local National Guard volunteers trained muskets on the oncoming coach lamps. Imagine the royal family's shock. A shabby blockhouse built to collect tolls peers up like an armed scarecrow, and a voice hails the travelers to declare themselves. Picture a warm Havana evening in 1764. A salt-rimmed breeze drifts across the Malecon while lantern light trembles over the water. A trim brigantine eases past the fortress, her hold packed so tight with chained black bodies that the ship's seams groan louder than the gulls. On the quarterdeck, the captain opens a letter embossed with the royal arms of Charles III. The parchment says nothing about people. It calls them pieces of cargo and grants the bearer a quiet tax rebate for every surviving piece landed alive. The signature at the bottom belongs to the same monarch who, in Madrid's public squares, preaches reason, science, and the brotherhood of man. Welcome to the hidden ledger of Spain's most celebrated enlightened king. Welcome to the tale of Charles III, the reformer who profited from slavery. Charles was born in 1716 and spent his youth in the operatic courts of Parma before seizing Naples in 1734. There, as the urbane Charles VII, he banned the Camorra, launched Europe's first modern public health board, and funded excavations at Pompeii. Diplomats, praised his curiosity. Voltaire called him the least prejudiced prince of his age. Yet the same Naples that he beautified with Rococo palaces also relied on enslaved Africans to sugarcoat its coffee and chocolate. Bourbon bookkeepers kept those purchases off the royal balance sheet, a rehearsal for the far larger stage Charles would stride onto in 1759, when the death of his half-brother Ferdinand VI placed the Spanish crown upon his head. Spain in the 1760s was reeling from defeat in the 7 Years' War. Havana had fallen to Britain in 1762 and was ransomed back only after a humiliating treaty. Treasury officials whispered that, without new revenue, the empire itself might unravel. Charles responded with the Bourbon reforms, a capitalist shock therapy that abolished medieval guild barriers, modernized tax farming, and here lies the shadow, supercharged the Atlantic slave trade. The king did not announce that last measure from the balcony of the royal palace. Instead, he delegated the dirty work to private consortia, such as the Compañía Gaditana de Negros, chartered in Cadiz in 1765. The company's printed prospectus promised investors returns surpassing those of the Indies galleons, a coy euphemism for the flesh packed into its hulls. By cross-referencing the KD's notarial registers with the Registro de Embarcaciones de la Habana, historian Antonio Garcia Baquero has tallied more than 34,000 Africans landed by Spanish licensed vessels in just the first decade of Charles's reign. The crown's silent dividend came in two forms: customs fees on each captive and a fixed 10% share of company profits funneled into the Banco de San Carlos, Madrid's embryonic central bank. The arrangement echoes 2 centuries early the way Warren Delano Jr. laundered silver from opium sales in Canton through the American-backed Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank. Delano kept his name out of the Clipper logs. Charles kept his initials off the slave manifests. Secrecy was the key commodity both men trafficked. Contemporaries still applauded the monarch's humanitarian decrees. They saw him introduce smallpox inoculation, pave the boulevards of Madrid, and throw open the University of Alcalá to poor scholars. What they did not see were the secret clauses in the 1764 Reglamento de Comercio Libre that allowed Cuban planters to pay in kind, sugar, coffee, indigo, for every captive purchased. Sugar could be shipped tax-free to Cadiz, refined and re-exported to Catholic monasteries across Europe. The profits made Bourbon courtiers rich enough to build marble villas along the new Paseo del Prado, lavish addresses that much later would house the Prado Museum's galleries of saints and angels. Charles's public myth as an enlightened reformer hardened further after 1767, when he expelled the Jesuits. Spanish pamphleteers hailed the expulsion as a brave strike against obscurantism. The exile, however, also removed the loudest critics of forced labor from the American missions. In the silence that followed, Cuba's annual slave imports leapt from roughly 3,000 per year in 1760 to more than 7,500 by 1775. Figures documented in the painstaking ledgers of the Royal Accountancy Office, today archived in Seville's Archivo General de Indias. Read those ledgers, and you spot a curious annotation beside several shipments. Fr. Curator Marta Rosello recently demonstrated that the initials refer to Fondo Reservado, a discretionary slush fund controlled directly by the Crown. Money from Fondo Reservado purchased cannon for Havana's rebuilt fortress and underwrote scientific expeditions. Charles could flaunt to Europe's philosophe as proof of Spanish rationalism. The same explorer who mapped Patagonian flora relied on coins minted from slave-grown sugar. If the arrangement feels familiar, consider the American robber baron Leland Stanford, another self-styled progressive whose Central Pacific Railroad promoted manifest destiny while crushing Chinese laborers beneath impossible quotas, or the Cabot family of Massachusetts, whose Harvard endowments were fattened with profits from smuggling Turkish opium into Kwantung. Stanford, Cabot, Delano, Bourbon, different centuries, same playbook. They all wore the mask of civic virtue while cashing checks written in misery. So how did Charles keep the mask in place? First, he weaponized paperwork. Spanish colonial law required every governor to submit a quarterly borrador general, a draft audit of revenues and demography. Charles's Council of the Indies quietly approved a supplemental cipher in 1763. Governors could record the arrival of ebony cargo under the broader heading of mercancías para fomento, or goods for development. No racial terminology, no illicit odor. Modern Puerto Rican archivist Angel Lopez Cantos uncovered dozens of such reports, their column headings washed in bureaucratic beige. The trick was classic Enlightenment bookkeeping: use neutral language to sanitize violence. Second, the king deployed proxy merchants drawn from the rising Catalan bourgeoisie. Families such as the Goytisolos and Muntadas opened counting houses in Veracruz and Santiago de Cuba, employing Irish intermediaries to negotiate slave purchases along the Bight of Benin. Those middlemen signed all the export insurance forms, keeping Bourbon fingerprints off London's Lloyd's ledgers. Barcelona newspapers filled with notices for trading expeditions of mixed goods, a wink that every coffeehouse investor understood. Charles, meanwhile, could pose for Goya's brush, wearing a silk sash of the Golden Fleece, his right hand resting not on a ledger, but on a telescope, symbol of enlightened vision. Was the concealment watertight? Not entirely. In 1771, Dominican friar Francisco José Jaca penned a fiery manuscript called Infierno de Azúcar, denouncing slave ships as floating cathedrals to Mammon. The Inquisition seized every copy, yet one slipped into the Archivo Nacional in Mexico City. Historian Christopher Schmidt Nawara translated its marginalia. There, in the margins, Jaca scribbled, "The king knows, for the king collects." That sentence never saw European daylight, but it proves that whispers circulated. Still, without the telegraph or a free press, the whispers could not coalesce into scandal. Modern data make the picture starker. Economist David Eltis's transatlantic slave trade database shows a spike of voyages flagged SPA, Spain, from 1763 to 1778. Overlay those points on a map of sugar prices, and the correlation is almost perfect. Spanish sugar exports doubled, so did slave arrivals. The profits slid quietly into bourbon vaults, lining up beside silver from Potosi and cochineal from Oaxaca. Charles's agents and caddies rolled the windfall into government bonds that financed dockyards, lighthouses, and the ornamental fountains tourists still Instagram today. The city sparkled, the hold of the brigantine stank. Critics sometimes argue that Charles merely allowed slave commerce rather than expanded it, but a royal decree dated October 24, 1765, preserved in the Simancas archive, explicitly commands the intendant of Havana to facilitate without impediment the landing of piezas de Guinea when borne by vessels holding a crown asiento. That language changed Havana's port from a regulated entrepot into a revolving door of human trafficking. Numbers support the shift. Between 1715 and 1760, fewer than 60,000 Africans reached Spanish America. In the 28 years from 1760 to Charles's death in 1788, the figure exceeded 140,000, a growth rate unmatched elsewhere in the Iberian Atlantic.